Okay, I think we can start. Very good. Hello, everyone. Um, I'm B. Ruby Rich. I'm the editor of Film Quarterly, and I'm here to welcome you to the Page Views webinar. They're still in their infancy. This is only the third one we've presented, but the Page Views feature has been part of Film Quarterly for many years. Every issue has a conversation with an author who is chosen and conducted through an interview by Bruno Guaraná, our contributing editor and Page Views editor. And a chapter of the book, often the introduction, is downloadable for free, courtesy of the publisher, on our website. And if you visit filmquarterly.org after this conversation, you'll find Bruno's introduction to the book, his interview with Lúcia, and that will also appear. It is in there now in the spring edition, volume 74, number 3 of Film Quarterly. On the website, there's also a downloadable chapter from Lúcia's book, Lúcia Nagib's new book, Realist Cinema as World Cinema, Non-Cinema, Intermedial Passages, Total Cinema. And if you want to revisit today's conversation and share it with people after, in a few days it will be up on the Film Quarterly website, where it will live, for eternity, or at least as long as this part of the internet may last. So today I'm really pleased to welcome back Bruno Guaraná, our contributing editor and Page Views editor, and to welcome for the first time here into the Film Quarterly webinar, Lúcia Nagib, speaking to us from London, but officially from the University of Reading, scholar, author, and I think increasingly filmmaker. So joining us from London, and Bruno from New York, and myself here somehow in Paris. So welcome to everyone joining us globally, and let's begin. Bruno, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ruby. Hello, everybody. I just want to make sure that my audio is okay, because I had to change my microphone last minute.
Yes, everyone's here and you sound fine.
Great. Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Lúcia. I want to first thank Lúcia's generosity with her time to be able to join us for our webinar and also participating in the interview for this issue's Page Views section. I've been following Lúcia's work for many years now, and she's been an inspiration of mine, especially on her work on Brazilian cinema, which is my focus as well in my research. So it really is an honor to be able to interview her so many years after I started my career. And it feels ever more special to do that about a film that's not about Brazilian cinema. And it'll make it, it'll take all my strength to not divert the conversation entirely away from the book and just talk about our, niche.
You better
but anyways, I'm just going to introduce talk a little bit about the book and my impressions on the book to the audience that might not have read it yet. But I should say that the book is available as open access for everybody to download, and I highly recommend the read. It's really, really fascinating. And also the Page Views issue, the Page Views publication, this issue, which is available on our website, as Ruby said earlier. So the book is called Realist Cinema as World Cinema. And I just wanted to start my talk by quoting directly from Lúcia's first page. She writes, "This book is about films and filmmakers committed to reality." And then later on, these filmmakers feel part of and responsible for this material world and want to change it for the better. And I was very intrigued by these first few sentences, with the idea that I think really made me interested in cinema to begin with, of a commitment to reality, right? The implications of cinema and the relationships of films with the material world that surrounds them. So she finds that what brings these films together in their commitment to reality across world cinema history is what she calls a realist mode of production, right? So addressing this kind of cinematic commitment to reality, she also makes a twofold claim in the book that I think is really important. First is the employment of the term realist cinema in lieu of the more common but much vaguer term world cinema, right? And she thinks that the term realist cinema is a better, much more precise descriptor of the kind of cinema that we often refer to as world cinema. And the second part of that claim that I think is the most important one is a vouching for an understanding of realism, not as discourse and not as effect, but as I mentioned before, as a mode of production, right? What is realism at the point of production will be the core of our conversation today. So I think that it's this rigid approach to realism that really helps her illuminate the relationship of films with their surrounding reality and their commitment to reality, right? That framework, I think, allows for important questions to be asked that may be dismissed otherwise. One of them is, which reality do these films modify? Another one, how do they attempt to modify such reality through cinematic means? Or how and where does reality creep up in these films? And I think it's a very interesting way to frame this. But overall, it allows us to think about the film's presentation of reality, their reflexivity, right, or how they foregrounded their own artifice of production, as well as their social and political impact in the material reality, which again is what I find most interesting here. So in other words, what she's doing is, while not dismissing realism as a construct, she redirects our focus elsewhere, right, in the tangible relationship between cinema and the world surrounding it. But what I think is important to highlight here is that to speak of realism as a mode of production does not mean prescribing specific traits as qualifiers of a kind of realist cinema. The book's efforts are concentrated in an investigation to find, to name, and to describe those elements that are already part of cinema, right? And if we refer to Bazan's words, right, that the idea of cinema precedes the invention of cinema, the idea of a totality of the world being reproduced by cinema, is where we find these things that Lúcia Nagib pointing to. And her focus throughout the book is mostly on films that articulate, in one way or another, their relationship with the profilmic, and as well as their own indexicality. And she is able to include and analyze films as distinct as The Act of Killing or The Last Chrysanthemums or contemporary Brazilian cinema, right? So in order to sort of manage such a large corpus, she does something that I find really interesting and very didactic that helps us understand this in more specific terms. So she divides this corpus into three submodalities of the realist mode of production. The first submodality is what she calls non-cinema, and that refers to films that intervene in their social and political reality, sometimes at the expense of their own integrity as cinema, right? Their raison d'etre is to modify reality. The second submodality is intermediate passages, by which she refers to those moments in cinema that promote intermediality or an engagement with other arts and media, and through which films interact with their own reality as well. And the third submodality is the idea of total cinema, referring to films that desire to achieve an integral or all-encompassing realism at the same time that they also acknowledge their inability to be indeed totalizing. So the book really is packed with close analysis of a very wide range of films across the globe, and that fit into one of these three categories. And it helps shed light on the social and political significance that goes beyond film aesthetic, right? Even revisiting classics such as Ossessione, and Lúcia has a very interesting reading of that book, of that film. But I think more broadly, the reframing of realism allows the book to highlight an ethics of the real that is embedded in cinema, and reminds us of the potential of cinema to affect, modify, and even improve upon the world that surrounds us, right? And the side effect of that implication is that it calls on the responsibility of filmmakers, film historians, and scholars, as well as critics, to attend to that fact. And as if this enterprise were not enough, Lúcia also, I think, is innovating the way that we do scholarship, because she includes she makes a companion piece for, I think, the 7th chapter of her book, which is the one on Brazilian cinema. She has made a documentary film alongside Samuel Paiva, in which she addresses the passages to the real that is at the center of the book. And to me, that term really is the pièce de résistance of the book. And I'm very interested to learn more about that and have a longer conversation about it. But in the hopes that I was able to do some justice to the the incredible project that this book is. I will start with my first question to Lucia, also giving her the opportunity to correct me or expand on something that I have missed out on about the book. But I really wanted to start with the basics, which is this idea of realism. So how do you, Lucia, define realism in your book? And how do you think it can be detected in films?
Hey, is it my turn now?
It is your turn, Lucia, please.
I thought that he got frozen, and that's why my turn arrived. But
No, you're
finish,
fine.
Bruno. I'll be listening to you for as long as you like, because you know you're making maybe a better job than I have done with my book, explaining my ideas. So yeah, hello everybody. It's such a huge privilege to be here today, speaking to these marvelous people from Film Quarterly, which is a publication I've been reading throughout my life. Is such a wonderful search of source of information, and has been so important for my research, not least for the writing of that chapter on the act of killing that you have mentioned before. There is such a fantastic dossier about it in Film Quarterly. Thanks so much to Ruby Rich for her amazing work with this publication, Rebecca Prime, who has coordinated this event on Page Views, and Bruno Guaraná. What a surprise to meet you, Bruno. I keep asking me how come I hadn't come across you before, because I think it's the dream of every writer to have a reader like you, somebody who really understands, that does not read diagonally through your work, but really reads the arguments, understands them, and respond to that, to your arguments with such clarity and insightfulness, even making connections that perhaps I hadn't made before. And I think that's the dream of every researcher, every writer, to have a reader like you. Thank you so very much. The commitment to reality and realism in my work, you know, I started to think about it. Realism is the reason why I started to study cinema. That was not my intention originally. I had worked with literature. I was the editor of a journal called Leia Livros in the bygone past, in Brasiliense in the 70s, early 80s. And but then there was a guy called Werner Herzog, whose films I started to watch during the period. It was starting to open up in Brazil, but it was still the time of the military dictatorship. And the Goethe Institute in Brazil was a kind of resistance, a place of resistance to the dictatorship, and would show films there, bypassing the censorship. Because the films were in 16 millimeters that they received, they were not obliged to pass by censorship. But if they were discovered to be showing things that were against the government, obviously they would be punished. And severely punished with the breaking of the diplomatic relations and so on. But they risked everything in order to bring all those marvelous films from the new German cinema that were being made in those days. And that's why those people still have such a privileged place in my scholarship, Wim Wenders, Herzog, and so many others. And I keep quoting Lotte Eisner, the historian of cinema, because I've also translated her book into Portuguese, The Haunted Screen. And interestingly, Herzog first drew my attention through a book he wrote called Walking on Ice, Vom Gehen im Eis. I learned German in order to translate this book into Portuguese. So I translated this book, but then I was so fascinated by his work because it was so physical. It was a physical engagement with the reality. Cinema Novo was a cinema that had a huge influence on the new German filmmakers from the late 1960s onwards. And Glauber Horschel was absolutely fascinated by the production in South America. And he came to shoot Aguirre in the Amazon jungle. And he wanted to have that kind of physical experience of what it is to be in the jungle, what it is to be an Indian, and the book Vom Gehen im Eis is a kind of promise that he made to walk from Munich to Paris in the belief that if he did so, Lotte Eisner, who was about to die, would not die, would survive. And so he went on foot. It's almost 1,000 kilometers in the winter to see Lotte Eisner. So that whole story simply absolutely fascinated me. And the way that it connected to cinema. And there is a phrase by Glauber Horschel that says, where he says, in a conversation with João Guimarães Rosa, who was a writer he highly respected and emulated, he said, Guima told me that if he had been born in my period, in my era, he would have been a filmmaker rather than a writer. And so that was the age of cinema, o século do cinema, as Ismail Xavier has said it. And so I had to move to cinema too, and because the reality was there, and cinema being so close, the most mimetic medium that there is to reality, I found completely fascinated by this idea that cinema had a direct interaction with the physical reality. So physical realism is the most, let's say, the most important point in my approach to the question of realism, and the physical engagement on the part of filmmakers with this real is something that I explore in part one of my book, Ethics of Realism. Mm-hmm. So,
Lucia, can I interrupt you for 1 second? I just want to, you said something so interesting that I just want to get you to go back to before you move on. When you were talking about the Goethe Institute and what they did during the dictatorship in Brazil, they did something similar in Argentina. I found out when I went to Buenos Aires after the dictatorship, and I think this is something people do not know, the history of the Goethe Institute, because of the denazification after World War II. The Goethe Institutes were kept completely separate from the German government to avoid any censorship. And they played such a pivotal role as almost like a safe house or a kind of open port inside these other countries. So I was fascinated to hear you say this about Brazil as well, because I knew the case in Argentina. And I think we all owe them a debt in terms of cinema in those years and what they did for the world.
Absolutely. The Goethe Institute received a lot of money in those days from the German government because they wanted to produce what they called multiplicators. And those multiplicators of German culture was an attempt at renewing the image of Germany after that horrendous history of Nazism and the Holocaust and so on. They appointed the most brilliant minds to be their directors, and the directors themselves were very often artists, poets, filmmakers. I remember Klaus Better was a filmmaker. So many of them. They were great people. They became friends, and they generated communities around, because they organized so many amazing events. I mean, when nobody had heard about Habermas was there speaking to crowds in São Paulo, the crowds were so big that they didn't fit in the auditorium. They had to put a screen outside for the overflow. So it was just amazing, you know. And Habermas, who can understand Habermas well? It's really very difficult. But going back to just to finish the question of realism.
Yes, sorry, Bruno.
Totally
I steered her away.
This is fascinating. Yeah.
It's a fascinating thing. And they changed me. They made me become interested in cinema because of that. But there is, in philosophical terms, there is the first chapter of the Phenomenology of the Spirit by Hegel. It's called the Gesinnliche Gewissheit, the sinnliche Gewissheit, which means the sensual certainty of the world. This is the principle of everything. Then he turns it upside down and, you know, goes to the absolute abstraction. But the first movement that we have to start thinking is the certainty that things exist, that this table is here. If I touch it, it's here. If I shoot a person, the person will die. It's not a discourse. It's not just discourse. It's not words. I can kill. Bolsonaro is killing thousands, if not millions, of people. Now, this is reality. It's not discourse. The tragedy is that many people in Brazil think that this is just discourse and treat it as rhetoric and discourse. We have to acknowledge the existence of reality. This is an ethical position that is supported by Alain Badiou in terms of his definition of event and situation. So recognizing the event of truth and responding to this event of truth is what he calls ethic. The situation is a collection of events and that have become frozen and established as a situation, like the political party that governs the country is the situation. The event is live. You cannot predict. To be able to react, accept the truth of the unexpected event is what for him is to adopt an ethical stance towards reality. And I totally subscribe to this idea. But we can talk about films after all that.
Yeah, so this is very interesting because it makes me wonder that in that respect, no film is pure discourse, right? Like every film has a stake in its reality, right? And I think this is part of your quest to reframe the idea of world cinema through the idea of realist cinema, that it is impossible. It's impossible to negate the idea of reality. Is that fair to say?
No, yeah, no, you are absolutely right. Let me just make a disclaimer here to start with. I'm not excluding any films. I am totally in favor of commercial films. I think that people need distraction, diversion, comedy, tragedy, everything is valid. But there are films that choose to put its emphasis on the mode of production, and others that choose to put the emphasis on the post-production of the film. So Lev Manovich has summarized that very well. And it's a historical process because with the advent of digital technology, there is huge amounts that you can do in post-production. So much so that Lev Manovich argues the moment of production has become like a very minor step towards the big moment of post-production, where you really create a film. You edit, you change the color, you change the sound, you erase a character you don't want there anymore, you change the features, you do loads of things. But there are still the films that put their bets on the mode of production. So we cannot study all the films. Perhaps in the future, I will be studying CGI and other things. There are colleagues who do this so well, and they do that much better than me, because I spent my life studying mode of production. So, you know, so that's their area, the area of research. My area of research is those filmmakers that have this commitment with a political interference in the phenomenological world, and also who recognize that this world exists without them. So that is not correlationist, as has been the discussion of speculative realism, and the fact that, you know, speculative realism has a very valid point about us trying not to consider that everything is done with relation to the human being. So it's not because it's important for, so humanism was in the center of neorealism, for example. So speculative realism would be, in a way, an alternative to that gesture. And if you think about the film of Kiarostami and his attempts at putting a camera there, going to sleep, and then coming back to see what was captured. Yeah, so that's the kind of thing. How is the world without me? How is, what is, you know, there are speculative realists who even consider that a boulder, a stone, has a thought of its own and a logic of its own, you know. So that we don't, that is a mystery that we don't understand. I like this idea very much, because I think we have done enough damage to the world, and it's good to see the other side, you know, responding.
I definitely think it raises the stakes of cinema, right? As you said, there's an ethics related to filmmaking, and I think film circulation and film watching as well. But I think, so this might be a good moment to ask you to tell us a little bit more about that first submodality that you talk about, which is the idea of non-cinema. What do you mean by that, and what's a good example that perhaps you find most illuminating of that term?
I start that part with a film by Wim Wenders called The State of Things. And Wim Wenders made this film which focused on the impossibility of making films. It was a little bit the postmodern condition, the sense that, you know, all stories have been told, there are no more stories. And also that the cinema that he used to worship, the American cinema that he loved so much, was also declining, was not that American cinema anymore. So he makes a film which is inquires about the possibility of making films. It's a film that starts making a film, and then the money dries out, they can't make the film anymore, and it's all about not making a film. And at the end, both he and the American producer of his film are killed as they embrace. It's a wonderful image at the end of this film. So this is one that is historically located in a postmodern era. But then I move on to study Jafar Panahi and the symbolic film, This Is Not a Film. And because Panahi cannot make a film, according to the Iranian penalties that were imposed on him. So he has to spend 20 years without making films, without directing films, without leaving the country. He has to stay there. So undercover, he's already made 4 films after that, and all of them negate themselves as films. It's as if it's his own life. But it is a self-defeating proposal, because obviously they end up being films. But it is a kind of cinema that competes with life itself, that would like to be just life. And then the third one is that I study under this category is Taboo by Miguel Gomes, which is a hollow film, a film that doesn't talk about what it is proposing to talk, which is the crimes committed by the Portuguese colonial power in Africa. This is the thing that cannot be touched. So they talk about loads of things, and the film is not made. That was proposed to be made. So the three of them have a political question at the heart of them, and it's a kind of cinema that competes with real life, right, and wants to be real life. It's a kind of dilemma.
Yeah, yeah. And then the other submodality talk about that I think fits, maybe fits a
and then obviously the act of killing. Yeah.
Yes. On the other side of the spectrum of submodalities, I see, right, if there is a spectrum, I see the myth of total cinema. That's a term they borrow from Bazin. So what is that? What's at stake here in these films, and what kind of realism do we see there?
Yeah. So at the end of that piece, Bazin says it is as if cinema had not been invented yet. So it goes full circle, you know. So for Bazin, the total cinema was something that started with a kind of sci-fi idea that you could create the world. There is a book by Barjavel called Cinema Total, which is precisely that idea that you could recreate life with its smells, fourth dimension, everything. So Barjavel, in a way, he predicted everything that's happening now, the virtual reality, and so everything is virtual, but you interact with it as if it was real life. So that was total cinema. And Bazin obviously had read this book and was under the influence of that when he wrote his piece. But for him, it's a myth, the myth of total cinema. It's not possible. And it is total illusion. But at the end of the illusionary process, you go back to reality. So my take on that is a kind of totalizing impetus that animates a number of filmmakers, and it has I divide it in three parts. I divide in the total artwork, then total history, and then total cinema, which is the cinema and landscape. And I analyze in the first Visconti and his attempt at including all art forms in the opera form, which is for Wagner was a total artwork, and then total history in the Heimat project, which aims at covering the entire history of Germany. And then the total cinema at the end with the totalizing landscapes. And then I talk about a number of films.
Yeah, and all these are failed attempts to achieve this total cinema that Bazin himself admits to be a myth, right?
Yeah, I subscribe to the idea of the myth. Yeah.
Right. and then finally, the third aspect, we'll go back to the Passage of the Rio, in which you employ a term that you've been investigating for many years, the idea of intermediality. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. There is a scholar called Agnes Petto, and she is so extraordinary. She's she's quite foundational in the scholarship that she launched on intermediality, the question of the in-between. And one thing that I like very much in her approach is how she defines the materiality of the media when it is used, of other media, when it's used in film. For example, the materiality of painting or of sculpture, of other media that preceded film that is more virtual than these other media. And I think I have a lot in common with her way of thinking through intermediality. And I started to think about many films that are very self-reflexive in the way that they use other medium, and revealing them as such. As it's not. If you just think about, I have just written a piece about Glauber Rocha now, where I start by commenting on that poem by Mário Faustino, that is shown right at the beginning of Terra em Transe, written on a page. And because there are sand dunes behind that, it is as if the poem was written on the sand dunes of Rio, where he was shooting this film. So on the blank page, so it is poem. There is a materiality of the poem there. And then you identify it as poem. It's not as if the poem was covertly used in the film. It's overtly there as poem. And then I started to examine a number of Brazilian films in which the interference, the intervention of other art forms break the fabric of the film, cause a tear there. It's not something that is hidden, it's open. So when Beto Bernanke in Delicate Crime uses real painting, the act of painting in the film, so the painting is happening at that very moment. It could be a good painting, it could not be, and in which case the film would not even exist, because it's the history of that painting. And so that's what I mean, the response to the unexpected, unpredictable event. And the painter and the model, they interact, they have a physical interaction on that moment of the painting, and it is a transformative experience for the model and for the painter, because she wasn't a model, and she's a person who has a disability. She doesn't have a leg, and for the first time she appears naked without the leg in front of the camera. And he also exposes himself, because if she had to expose herself, he would do the same and become as vulnerable as her. So it was a way of getting to the physicality of the production of an artwork. Right. And I discovered so many examples in Brazilian cinema, and in discussion with the filmmakers, I was so relieved to see that they really acknowledge this fact, that they, like the book that inspired City of God was a chance for Fernando Meirelles to get to know the favelas in Rio that did not belong at all to his own reality. And then
because it was written by someone from that community, right?
From that community. And then he made a film with the people from the favelas in Rio. Right. So yeah, that is the point I wanted to
make. So this idea that these other artworks have a material and social history in and of themselves that is recognized, right, by filmmakers, cast members, and crew alike, as well as by spectators at the moment in which there's this junction between cinema and whatever other artwork. And like I said, it breaks up maybe the artifice of production, or it becomes perhaps extra diegetic, right? It gains a new meaning.
Can I jump in for a second? I'm curious to just bring one other aspect in, because world cinema is the beginning of the title of the book. And I wonder, you've spoken about a few, but I wonder, Lúcia, if I can get you to talk a bit about what it means today in 2021 for you to be talking about world cinema when the world is so changed. Like world cinema, realist cinema, does that have the same, do they echo each other the same way now as they did when you were writing? And how do you see your own title now even? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I do acknowledge that world cinema is a bit of an outmoded kind of term, but I think it's very important to have this in our horizon all the time, because things today tend to be all muddled up. If you go to the streaming services, they connect everything to that main menu that we get, which is all English spoken films. majorly from the United States, but also from Britain. And this seems to be the world, because when they recommend to you other films, because you watch that, then perhaps you will like this one. It might be a film in a different language, but this is camouflaged under that link that is made between an American film or a British film or series that you have watched and the other world cinema that sometimes, it's like somebody who can't speak English so well, so they speak in that kind of dialect. So it is important that we know and we keep in mind that the world exists with all its differences. And that is what makes the richness of our experience of cinema. Cinema is something that we learn from it all the time. And we have to recognize and continue to have our interest excited by the difference that exists in all the cultures that surround us. So I think world cinema is still a refuge and a safe haven for diversity and inclusion. And we should keep this term alive and well for that reason.
You write a little bit about how at the same time that these streaming services give more accessibility to foreign films, which is not a very good term, it also decontextualizes them, right? Which is exactly what you're talking about here.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful that they have these films there, but they are hidden.
Yeah.
So I think our mission of us writers of on film is to help the audiences to locate these jewels that are lost there. Maybe you can find them somewhere, but if you write about them, the people will more actively search for these films, because what is being eroded from us is our ability to actively search for things. Things are being given to us. Mm-hmm. Very often we turn on the TV intending to watch something, but suddenly there is something else on offer and you just go for it. So it's important that we keep reminding people, but look, there is that other one, there is that other one. I think that's our mission to do that.
Yeah, and I think speaking of taking agency, I've already addressed this, but you do this great thing, which is to create this companion piece to the book by directing alongside Samuel Paiva the film Passages, which is a documentary film in which you interview filmmakers about their films and their passages to the real. How did this project come about, and tell us a little bit more about the film?
This film is the result of a major bilateral project between my University of Reading and the University of São Carlos in São Paulo, state of São Paulo, Brazil. So in Brazil, the project was funded by FAPESP, and here in the UK by the AHRC. And to both of which I am very grateful for their support. And the project had as its aim to retell the history of Brazilian cinema via intermediality. So via the dialogue of all the films with the other artworks that participated in their genesis. So, for example, Chanchada obviously is a huge and important example of it, because it was a very Brazilian kind of musical comedy, very connected with carnival, with theater, with radio, with music. And other periods of Brazilian cinema also saw some interesting peaks and moments of creation in their dialogue with other artistic forms. Obviously, music is so strong in Brazil that it plays a huge role and occupied like half of the film because of that. So for me and Samuel, our part of the research was to look at the Mangue Beat and Ari do Movie, the interaction between the musical movement Mangue Beat and the cinematic movement Ari do Movie. But I come from São Paulo, and Samuel from Pernambuco. And then we decided to make a dialogue because there were so many other fitting examples in the state of São Paulo as well. So we started this dialogue, and it turned out that they were really working together, the filmmakers from Pernambuco and from São Paulo. So it was a wonderful marriage of creative minds. And in the interviews, many more relations and connections emerged that we focused on, and then became part of the film. But the film, we have more than 200 publications by now, and they are just fabulous. And I have to mention that you should not concentrate on me, because there are all my team of researchers, of just extraordinary researchers in Brazil and in the UK, who have done fantastic work as well, and they deserve to be seen.
Yeah, what I find, go ahead, Ruby.
No, I was just going to say, later we can get you to send us a link for this that we can incorporate, where people can get access to this wider project. So thanks for that, Lucia.
Yeah, sure, I can, yeah.
Sorry, Bruno, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the film does two things, right? It really illustrates your work in this concept of passages to the real. But it also, as you said, recovers and archives a history of the rebirth of Brazilian cinema, which was really cinema that was being made by very few people, right? And so that connection that you found between Pernambuco and São Paulo filmmakers is not so much accidental as it was a mode of survival for them, right? They had to establish these connections. They had to produce films. I think one of the filmmakers mentions, we made a co-production within Brazil. Brazil is so large, and it's so, yes, these places are so distant that we had to combine our forces. Yeah. So it's a very rich moment in Brazilian film history, as you know so well. You've written so much about it. Yeah.
I wonder if there are any of the attendees that would have questions.
So far, people are shy. So let me encourage anyone out there. If you have questions for Lucia or any of us, go ahead. But in the meantime, while we're waiting, Lucia, I know that we have about 10 minutes left. Mark's just put a little note for anyone who wants to ask anything. But I know that you yourself wanted to say something about this moment we're in now, this streaming moment, and how that is affecting cinema, how people are experiencing cinema, and how it's altering your focus in terms of your own work. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit from you while we still have time.
Yeah, COVID has brought a new enormous challenge that nobody was expecting. On top of the very dire situation in which cinemas were in already because of the evasion of the audiences from the cinema theaters to their private TVs. But nobody expected now the cinemas to have to effectively close their doors because of social distancing and all. So we don't know what is going to happen after that. But in the meantime, obviously these streaming services just grew exponentially to the point that now at the University of Reading in our science park, we are in the process of building a huge studio that is going to bring an American company to set up a huge studio there to produce blockbusters for Netflix and all the rest of it. So yes, so it is a good moment in one respect and not so good in another respect. But the fact remains, and I think that's the point of your question, that writing has become more and more enmeshed with the audiovisual medium. Everyone, like it started with Glaube Horsch in the century of cinema, but now more than ever, film is the way that people communicate. Like my nephews, or grandnephews of 4 years of age, they know how to make film. and they don't write yet, but they can make films. And and we scholars are communicating to our students via films. Videographic criticism is a genre that is growing too, and the students love it because they can analyze films through films. And I can see that, for example, Passages communicates much more easily these ideas that might sound so complicated in reading if you have to read them. It's a minority like Bruno and few others that will be interested in really reading, but viewing, you can reach a much wider audience, and they will understand those ideas, you know. Obviously, in Passages, I had to hide the whole theory, but just the evidence was compelling enough. So I'm very interested in continuing this exercise and making a film as my next project.
We have a question here I'm going to let you take up. A comment from Paritje Patra about the Goethe Institute, and Claudio Caldini in Buenos Aires also commenting on that, about their role and what Lav Diaz has written on the Goethe Institute as shaping his filmmaking career in the Philippines through organizing Super 8 workshops. And it's a request to know more about the Brazilian experimental work and the role that the Goethe Institute played there, and asking you, is there any book-length work on this?
In my knowledge, there isn't any book-length. What the Goethe Institute has done some 10 years ago, they have called all these people that once worked with them, were partners, were multiplicators and so on, and made a huge film that they put on the web. And perhaps people can still find it, with loads of testimonials and interviews with artists and so on. So it's a huge project just to memorialize this era that was so important.
That's great.
Yeah, they gave a great importance to experimentation, and they offered their facilities and venues to that very often. Yeah.
Now here we have the opposite, the other extreme, and a question from August Grotzka saying that very curious to hear whether economic analysis plays a role in realist cinema and how you defined it, as they haven't had a chance to read your book yet. But what would you like to say about the economics of realist cinema then?
Yeah, very good question. Realist cinema in principle needs much less money than a big production, but there are also very expensive. You can think about a film like The Story of the Weeping Camel that I analyzed in the last chapter of the book, which cost nothing, and they had exactly the amount of stock that they needed for the full length of the film, so they could not waste any shot. It's this miraculous film that we have, and that shoots the birth of a camel, and the birth of exactly that camel that they wanted to be born. And the camel is an albino camel, and the camel is rejected by the mother, and the mother is reconciled with the calf via the music playing of that particular Mongolian violin. Okay, so this is one kind of, and then you have films that I also analyze, like Leviathan, which is a very expensive film with, you know, state-of-the-art equipment and the most famous Russian actors of our day. But still, the realist project is still there, you know. So the mode of production, the fact that they had to go travel thousands of kilometers to find the exact location in the real landscape, all that it plays a crucial role in the film. So I would call it realist as well.
So that's the span of the economics. Huh? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add to that the documentary, because if there's one mode that relies so much on its indexicality, it is the documentary film, And you analyze in particular the act of killing, but just the idea of documentary and its stakes at realism, which I think is kind of an unexpected move, right? And it is a whole different economic process, right? Economic mode of production, if you will.
Yeah, the act of killing emerged as a research project funded by the AHRC as well, like Passages. So with very little money, and it took 8 years.
And with a whole group of people,
Group of people, researchers that went to Indonesia to first of all to conduct research with the peasants that were being forced to almost, slave labor and so on. So it started as an anthropological project that then turned into that mixture of genres that the act of killing is. Yeah.
Well, I think we only have maybe 3 minutes left. And I wonder, do you have last thoughts that you want to leave people with, Lucia, about the kind of film that will be tailored for this moment that we are in now, what you expect, what you want? Any final words of wisdom coming out of all the work you've done, all the books you've written? What's on your mind now as we leave people behind and go offline?
I've been watching films. I mean, in the lockdown, that's mostly what you do at night. You watch films, you watch those fabulous series. But I've just seen recently Rocks, and I said, look at that. Realism is alive and well. I don't know if you guys have seen Rocks. Rocks is a wonderful film with those young female students, poor people living in London in council housing, but making a most fabulous film. None of them were actors before. They became actors in the making of the film. They improvised, and it's now running for 8 BAFTAs. So best director, best actor, everything. And then the other day I watched, Blinded by the Light. It's another amazing film, and animated by a clear realist proposal. And I think realism is still alive, but I am of a generation that is now perhaps not so much in touch with the new languages like social networks and things that occupy the minds of people much more these days. And I think I have a lot to learn from the new generation on how the social networks inflect their lives and the kind of works that they are going to be doing in the future. So I'm very much a spectator of the new generations as well.
Wonderful. That's a perfect ending. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, Bruno. Perhaps the next page views will be brought to everyone on TikTok in homage. So if you look on the side to the chat, you will see the links, and you can go onto the website. In a few days, you will find this conversation, and you can go on now to find the full interview originally from the journal, as well as the link to a section of the book, and point you to the book as a whole.
I'm just going to drop the link to our project.
Yes, it's in here already. It's fine. It's up above. Maybe we can ask to put it here again. But here is the book here. Passages is up above.
No,
and,
it's the intermediate project.
Oh, very good. And with that, we're going to sign off. Great. We'll have that posted as well, Lucia, with this on the website. So that's great. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.